Welcome to New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and I'm very happy to be back here with Russel Targ at a spot we did that famous remote viewing maybe 15 years ago.
About that or more.
And I'm being joined by Dr. Hurtak, JJ Hurtak, Dr. Desiree Hurtak, and we're all going to be at Contact in the Desert. If you can see this flyer, that's May 31st to June 4th at Indian Wells, California. Get tickets at contactinthedesert.com. What we're here to discuss, when we did this initial remote viewing, maybe I think it was really 18, 19 years ago, I wanted to find out what happened. I was able to get the target, and I want to know if there's a science, and we've been discussing the theories, and the Hurtaks will jump in. Something happened. It is no doubt that people can send their consciousness beyond time and space, but what do you feel are the theories that can prove this?
Well, I'm happy to chat with you, Alan.
Yes.
I don't think people are sending their consciousness beyond time and space.
Okay.
If you read the Buddhist writing on the subject, you go into the Prajnaparamita, what they say is that psychic abilities are available. You can see into the future, you can see into the distance, and all that happens because there's no separation for consciousness.
No separation. So consciousness, in a sense, doesn't exist in this time-space reality.
That's right. When we did a remote viewing with Ingo Swann, I once had a contract at SRI, Stanford Research Institute. We had a NASA contract for my ESP teaching machine. And we can talk about that another time. And the NASA guy said, we're about to launch a Pioneer spacecraft to Jupiter, Ingo. You've used your psychic abilities to look all over the place. Can you tell us, are we going to find anything interesting at Jupiter when we get there that we don't know about? Ingo looked back, took a puff out of his cigar and said, yeah, I noticed that there's a ring around Jupiter. It's a thick ring, probably made of ice crystals. And our contract monitor said, you must be thinking about Saturn.
Well, I remember that example.
And Ingo said, I've been looking at the universe for my entire lifetime. I'm not confusing Saturn with Jupiter. You'll find out that when your spacecraft gets there, that you'll have a large ring made of ice crystals. And when you see that, you can send me the pictures.
Right.
And a year and a half later, we got pictures from NASA showing indeed there were now NASA photographs of the rings around Jupiter. They greatly resemble the rings around Jupiter that Ingo was able to draw. And what that shows, it may not come immediately to your mind, is Jupiter is 500 million miles away.
Yes.
That's a long distance. It would take you an hour to get there at the speed of light.
Okay.
But when Ingo wanted to look at it, he just put down his cigar, looked up at the universe and said, looks to me like there's ice crystals around Jupiter. And what that means is that Jupiter is in his head already. Ingo does not have to fly to Jupiter.
Is it in his head, or just is consciousness the thing that the apparatus we're using to view all right here, in a sense?
Well, Alan, that's why I think you have to introduce the word non-local reality, because this is the same thing that Russell did with Elizabeth Rauscher. It's not a matter of going through space or going through time. It's all of it is known.
If you say it's all in his head, what's the science then? How do we look at the science of that?
Well, the most interesting thing in modern physics today is the idea of non-local connections between all things. Now, this is also not New Age. Schrodinger talked about entanglement and non-locality in the late 1920s. And then Einstein wrote a paper together with Podolsky and Rosen that said, your quantum theory says that when photons born together are separated, then they will instantaneously show one photon was affected by the other. So they're twin photons. We can have twins that are born together, and they frequently have very, very similar lives as though they're connected together.
This was the work of of Dr. Gottesman at the University of Minnesota back in the 60s, the study of the twins, which was a landmark paper at that time. And Russell, as you know, John Bell also contributed to the earlier work dealing with non-locality.
But this is entanglement. This is what lots of the entangled universe, Dean Radin, they all talk about this. Particles are entangled. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. It's the idea that when photons are born together in an entangled state, then they remain entangled. And if you grab one of them, the other one is still coherent. The simple example of entanglement, which is not quantum mechanical, is if you have two tuning forks, one on this side of the room and the other side of the room, and they're both tuned to A above middle C. So when you strike one tuning fork, then the other one surprisingly will begin to ring with very strong vibrations, even though they're separated by 20 meters. And it's because that they're entangled by the sound waves going through the atmospheric air, and they're both very high Q devices. The only thing that they can do if they're stimulated is ring at that frequency. So when you strike one, its identical twin tuning fork will ring. So that's a kind of a, that is what happens. You in high school physics, you do an experiment with the entangled tuning forks. And what John Stuart Bell showed in the 1960s, contrary to what Einstein thought, is that photons born together remain entangled. And Einstein was upset that when you grab one photon, the twin shows the coherence instantaneously. It's believed now that you cannot send a message using entanglement. They know signaling hypothesis.
But I have to say, like the Swiss Telecom actually did this, probably most famous experiment recent times, was that they did put two sister or daughter photons apart about 18 kilometers, and one is always spin up and the other one needs to be spin down. And as they switched one, the other one faster than the speed of light. And I think that's the most important thing. Well, practically immediately in terms of their own measurements, actually reacted. And so it's the same thing with the tuning forks, but the point is it's not like it's going through space or learning something. It immediately knew.
Well, let's go back to Ingo Swann just for a second. Are you saying that the photons or the thoughts or the images in his head is already entangled with all of time and space, or actually for all of us? Is that how he was instantly able to see the ring around Jupiter?
We don't know how he was instantly able to see the ring around Jupiter. I'm just was responding to your idea that he could go to Jupiter and see the ring. And although we don't know how he did that, he didn't go to Jupiter.
By traveling.
Right. He didn't.
Well,
just
a part of him is all our consciousness is non-local. When we talk about the thing called consciousness,
There's a great part in Russell's new film with Hella Hammond, and his new film is called Third Eye Spies. We recommend everyone to see it. It's going to be shown at Contact in the Desert.
That's right.
But someone asked Hella Hammond, well, go to this place. I think it was in Russia. She was supposed to be seeing something. And they go, well, maybe, are you going through the ceiling? She goes, I don't know if I'm going through the ceiling. I could be going through the cellar, but I'm seeing it all. So, her mind is just there.
That's right. Hella was totally happy to be in the non-local world.
well, I have to tell you that when I show that video where you're teaching me remote viewing that people can see on YouTube, I say to people, this is 10 years old, or maybe actually 20 years old, and they say, how can I remote view what's in Russell's pocket if it's already 20 years old? And I say, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, how do you explain how people, average everyday people, can actually get the target that's in your pocket from 20 years ago?
Because there's no separation, or they might be getting it from your mind.
Well, that's
in a contemporaneous way. When you do remote viewing to practice with a friend, after a while you want your friend to bring you objects where he or she does not know the answer. Right. Otherwise, you'll train yourself to read the person's mind. Now, the kind of non-locality, the formalism for non-locality that I'm interested in these days is something I developed with physicist Elizabeth Rauscher, which we call an eight-space model. That is to say, we grew up knowing that there are 3 dimensions. And when Einstein came along, he said the space-time we live in should really be characterized as 3 space dimensions plus a time dimension. And in relativity, that time dimension is multiplied by the square root of -1. So in all relativity calculations, you have X, Y, and Z, which are ordinary real numbers, and ICT, which is an imaginary number. Now, that does not create a non-local space-time for you. If you want a non-local space-time that would include psychic abilities, you have to have all of those 4 dimensions complex. So you have X, Y, and Z in time as real numbers on the one hand, and you have each of them multiplied by the square root of -1 on the other hand. So you have 4 dimensions, but each of them is a complex number. Each of them has a real number. Each of them has a real component and an imaginary number. Now, it's important to realize that I'm not saying ESP is pretty complicated. Let's add in another dimension to explain ESP. That's not what we're doing. We're not saying, well, there's 4 dimensions to explain relativity. Let's add in another dimension for ESP. What we're saying is that those 4 dimensions are really complex numbers, so that in the complex space-time, there will always be a path through the manifold where we live, where that complex distance is 0.
Well,
so there's no separation.
But I'm losing you a little bit for the layman understanding math. Do you want to
Well, I was
interpret
going
that
to
a
say,
little bit?
working also with Elizabeth, I mean, the most important thing is that it seems that the 4th dimension is connected also with the 8th dimension in some reality. So we're not just 3rd or 4th dimensional beings, that there is some sort of connection, even if it's not any kind of physical reality, with at least consciousness reality in these higher spaces. Would you agree with that, Russell?
Well, Alan said that we should explain this complex stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
In high school, you may remember that you measure the hypotenuse of a triangle as the square of the 2 sides of the triangle.
Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. I remember.
Now, if one of those sides happens to be a complex number, which in geometry and intermediate algebra you learned about in high school, you have the triangle whose sides are x squared, which is an ordinary real number, and the other number is iy squared. That is that ordinary real y multiplied by I. It's a perfectly good equation used in all of quantum mechanics, all of electromagnetic theory. The idea of a complex number is part of the reality we live in. You wouldn't have global distant measuring without that.
Okay.
However, if you have an x squared together with an iy squared, and you square those, they can add to 0. If x equals y, then x squared minus x squared gives you a hypotenuse in that complex domain.
But it doesn't make sense then. If the hypotenuse is 0, how do you explain its physical existence?
We're talking about life in the complex space-time.
Right.
In the real world, that manifests psychically. In the world of building bridges, you don't have complex space-time. But in quantum mechanics and in psychic ability, the complex space-time is very important.
And I was going to say, now we're starting working with the Tesseract, and we have things like Interstellar, those kind of movies. All that is working with these imaginary and complex numbers, because you can't work in the 4th dimension. You can't even measure the 4th dimension without including some of the imaginary numbers as well. And I think that's where it's starting to come in. But I know Elizabeth's main thing is that that 8 dimensions are possible to work in terms of a consciousness level. And I think that that's really important, that we're not just 3-dimensional or 4th dimensional beings, that were actually operating in other dimensions. And there's a project in Switzerland called the Blue Brain Project, and they're looking at the fact that the mind itself may be able to function in 7 dimensions.
Well, so years ago, I talked to Dr. John Stapp at the University of California, Berkeley, about the ability of non-locality, and he said it's far beyond the circuitry, the neurocircuitry of the mind. It's something.
Stapp famously said the most important discovery in all of physics is non-locality.
Correct. And we are now discovering we are non-local, multidimensional beings.
Okay, let's just describe non-locality, because we're local. Me and you, we're all here local. A non-local,
our consciousness is non-local.
Means it's not confined to this time, space, dimension.
That's right. Unfortunately, the square root of -1 became called imaginary 2 centuries ago. So we're not doing work with something that's pretend or made up. Imaginary is an unfortunate name. The proper name for what we're doing is we're dealing with complex space-time.
Well, it seems like we're still trying to make a bridge. We have the formulas, let's say. We have the actuality that remote viewing does work. We're trying to language it in a sense so we can understand its mechanics.
The most interesting thing I can tell you about remote viewing is an ability we all have that allows us to describe and experience what's going on in a distant location. And what's interesting about that is that it's no more difficult to describe what's going on in the Soviet Union or in China than it is to describe what's going on across the street here. Increasing the distance from 50 feet to 10,000 miles does not at all degrade the accuracy or reliability. And we spent 20 years looking at China and the Soviet Union from right here in Palo Alto. So we know that China and Russia are totally available with great accuracy, just as accurate as Rinconada Park at the corner of our street.
As I said before, there's no such thing as private or secret knowledge. Everything is available.
Right, and it comes out in your book, Third Eye Spies, that they not only saw a place, and I think that's something that people think about, okay, I went and I saw a movie theater, I went and saw, let's say, a Secret Service place or something like that, but they actually were able, in some cases, not everyone could do this as well as the people you were working with, but they actually got words and data of top secret names. Right. And so that's really interesting. It's not just looking and seeing.
That's right. Pat Price was able to penetrate the United States National Security Agency site in Virginia, was known as Sugar Grove at the time, with a radar listening point. And nothing can be more secret than an NSA secret listening spot. And Pat Price was able to describe that place 3,000 miles away from us, and then penetrate into the vault and describe what was written and file folders in a filing cabinet 3 stories below the Sugar Grove plant.
Well,
no secret knowledge.
But I want to ask a bigger question, because if that is true, and it is true, then consciousness, which we essentially are, we have to redefine the human being, our potential. How would you look at who we are in terms of your remote viewing history in a bigger light, in a bigger picture?
That our consciousness is non-local.
Yeah, but
the Buddhists think that you're much too attached to who you think you are anyway.
Right.
The functioning consciousness you have, when the Buddhist said that your awareness, the Buddha said that who you are is timeless awareness. Padmasambhava wrote a book called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. If you don't want to suffer, you've got to detach yourself from the attachment you have from the physical body. For example, if you think that who you are is what you see in the mirror in the morning, you're in for a lot of suffering. And the Buddhists want to help you diminish that suffering and recognize that your true nature is timeless awareness. And you can move from the person sitting on a chair in the living room. You have ability to send your awareness out into the spacious realms.
And we wrote a book on
I was
this
going to say
with
that.
Nagarjuna, or
Actually,
Nagarjuna, the second Buddha, as he is often referred to by the Asian scholars, who showed that we are basically able to live in this higher dimensional
I was going
consciousness.
to say, Dr. Hurtak and Russel Targ wrote a book called The End of Suffering, actually a beautiful cover by Ingo Swann, which talks about this higher consciousness. So if we are pure naked awareness, then we really need to accept remote viewing as an everyday phenomenon. We need to redefine the human being.
And I think that's really important because many people see it as a science. Okay, can you remote view someplace in Russia or someplace in Egypt? But in actuality, you can use it on a daily basis. I tell people, use it to find your keys, something very practical.
Yeah.
So there's many, many ways we can use this. And also, if you want to know where your child is, you can actually use it to try to like remote view where he is or she is.
Except, like Russell said, you have to separate the noise from the signal. What you think, we've been so programmed with this monkey mind that the job is to free ourselves from this conditioning.
Now, Desiree, I agree with you. You can definitely use remote viewing to find your car keys. We've used remote viewing to forecast the changes in the stock market, and we made $120,000 forecasting whether silver goes up or down. But the most important thing you can use remote viewing for is to discover who you are.
Okay,
Truly.
I love that.
That
Thank
is in
you.
the 12th century, Longchen Rabjan, who was a great Buddhist genius, Dharma master, he wrote a book called The Basic Space of Phenomena. It sounded like a physics book. And he was explaining in The Basic Space of Phenomena, published 800 years ago, he says that as you quiet your mind, you can move beyond ordinary space and time. And because your consciousness is independent of time, it's independent of cause and effect. The idea that for a physicist is very startling, stunning to hear somebody say your consciousness is independent of causality. And we know that because the most common of all psychic phenomena is a precognitive dream. Everybody has had some unusual dream that was then coming true the very next day. So on Friday night, you have a dream about the crazy thing that you're going to see in your garden Saturday morning. And what we would say is that your dream of Friday night was retro-caused by the thing that happened in the future. And retro-causality is one of the hot topics in modern physics, along with non-locality.
But would you say there's free will, or is it all determined? Like when your remote viewers saw where Hal Puthoff would be a half hour from where he even knew it, is everything predetermined in your there's no way to prove it, but what
You have, my opinion is
Yeah.
you have some free will, but much less than you think.
Right.
So,
Yes.
But one of the important things I think also is the fact that when you do precognition, you're saying that it usually goes like a week into the future, maybe a couple weeks. Some people have had experiences of maybe even 9 months, but those are odd. So it seems that the future is already arranged kind of from the present, but then it can take other avenues, which is why when it goes way into the future, things can be not as accurate in the present.
So to put this together, looking for a new definition, we can argue that we are part of a universal humanity. Homo universalis, as some of the ancient mystics referred to it, having all possibilities and options open to us depending upon how consciousness flows.
When you say Homo universalis, you mean that the fact that we are maturing into the idea that we are consciousness and not the thing we see in the mirror.
Where something, we have a body, but we're beyond a body.
That fits in with what your studies is, right, Russell?
That's right. We certainly agree with the idea that there aren't any secrets anymore. You can't hide anything. When Pat Price described the documents in the safe at the NSA guy came and said, well, the real target was on the other side of the hill. Why did you penetrate our facility where you're supposed to describe a log cabin? And Pat said, well, you know that in the psychic world, the more you try and hide something, the more it shines like a beacon in psychic space. So although I saw the log cabin, but your facility over here was shining so brightly, I assumed that that's what you wanted me to describe.
That's my favorite part of your film. I think that was great. And that's really how you got all the money for the remote viewing that you were doing. That's fantastic.
We got a lot of money from remote viewing through my very simple one act that I did with Alan.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I sat with the Undersecretary of Defense and the Director of NASA and people at the CIA, and they said, okay, show us something psychic.
Mhm.
And I said, well, I'll show you how to do it. How would that be? Because if I show you something psychic, you'll spend your time trying to figure out how I did the trick.
Mhm.
But if I tell you that I've got an unusual object in my briefcase, and I want you to describe the surprising images that come into your awareness, and he then draws the object in my briefcase, he's sold, because he's got this object on his blotter that he just drew and compare it with the object that I just put on his desk. And he said, well, that wasn't so hard. Maybe people can learn to do that.
And of course, you spent 20 years teaching people and the CIA how to do that.
And you're going to be showing that at Contact.
Yeah, let's talk about what you'll be saying. You're going to show your new movie that's
Third Eye Spies.
Third Eye, that goes into depth about what the Stanford research program was doing and with remote viewing, and what else is that?
And the most important thing about the film is that I have our CIA contract monitors on camera explaining that they had been polygraphed, and they are here to testify that the things that we show in the film and the remote viewing we describe really occurred, because they were there to verify it really happened, and the information we provided was useful.
And we're also going to do teaching about how to actually do remote viewing, which I learned in 5 minutes right here in this very spot. And we're going to do a little sample after this.
And also, remote viewing deals with the origins of civilization.
In what way?
Looking for the artifacts of the past, where they can be found. Work that we do with Elizabeth Rauscher in our book on mind dynamics, which covered some of the experiments at Stanford Research Institute, but also showed that you can apply it to all areas of science. Knowledge is not limited only to physics. It goes out in all directions. And that's the brilliance of what we call a graduation now towards a new definition of humanity.
And the Hurtaks also will be speaking at Contact. And what are you going to be speaking about?
Yeah, about some of the consciousness, but also how it relates to outer space.
We are the multidimensional humans waking up in a vast and awesome universe. And we have to be able to open the front door to all possibilities so we can act positively from the resources we have.
So look for all of us at Contact in the Desert in 2 weeks, May 31st, 2019 at Indian Wells, California. You can get tickets at contactinthedesert.com. You can see Russell's movie. You can take workshops.
And we'll show you how to do remote viewing.
Yes, and actually we're going to do a little sample remote viewing coming up that we're not going to play till after Contact in the Desert. But thanks for watching today. This is Alan Steinfeld from, where are we now?
Palo Alto, California.
That's the home of the remote viewing right here. Thank you for watching. Thank you.